The foolishness of preaching. Why is preaching regarded as foolishness? So for the few Christians that still read their Bibles, I'm going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, talking about the foolishness of preaching. Why is preaching foolish? Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, I'm going to get right into it. We see from verses 18 through 25, 4 times where the word foolishness is used. Used in the context of preaching. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18, he says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So in the first instance, we are told that the message of the cross, that the preached message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Foolishness. But only to those who are perishing. To the unsaved, to the unbeliever, to the impenitent. And notice that Paul says this about their perishing in the present tense. So he is saying, for those who are perishing, the gospel is foolishness. Now let me make a couple of comments here. You see here a contrast between those who are perishing and those who are saved. And the distinction is clear. There are 2 different groups of people who respond to the gospel in different ways. There are those who are perishing, and there are those who are being saved. Those who are perishing and those who are being saved. What you see here is Paul's description of individuals, whether or not they have been saved or not at this point, and whether or not their lives have ended. He is saying this, that there are those who are designated to perish, and to them, the word of God is foolishness. There are those who are designated to be saved, and to them, the gospel is embraced. And he is not talking about those. Now, keep in mind, when he says to those who are perishing, it cannot mean to people who have already died. It has to be people who are alive or who will become born and be alive. He is saying that there are people who are born to perish and are going to perish, and their destiny is inevitable to perish. And to them, the gospel will always be foolishness. The preached gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. Now, he says to us who are being saved that the gospel message is the power of God. Is the power of God. How do we understand this? How is it that to us the gospel is the power of God, But to those who are perishing, it is foolishness. If you are a Christian, especially if you have difficulty dealing with difficult topics in the scriptures, difficult doctrines, such as God's election and predestination, you may have a problem dealing with those particular parts of the Bible, as so many people do. I experience it every single day. But you are dealing with that very subject here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. The gospel goes out to all people. But it is not the power of God unto salvation for everyone. It is only the power of God unto salvation to the believer, those who are blessed with the grace of God to be saved. But to those who are perishing, the gospel is foolishness. Now, this is a good point where the impenitent sinner might want to ask the question, well, that's not fair. But yet, this is what the word of God says. To the soul who is perishing, the soul who is to perish, the gospel will always be foolishness. And listen, we witness and we share the gospel with so many people who reject it. And we get upset and we get frustrated and we are hard on ourselves because we feel that we weren't persuasive enough. But when you listen and understand what the word of God is saying, you will see here that there is no descriptor. Like somebody says, there's nothing here that addresses man's will. There's nothing in here about free will. You have the gospel message, which to the perishing soul is foolishness, but to the believing soul, it is the power of God. Why is it the power of God to those who believe, and why is it ineffectual to those who are perishing? And it has nothing to do with man's will. It has everything to do with the force put behind the word of God in terms of its effectiveness to save or not to save. God makes his gospel message powerful and effectual to the believers, and he makes it ineffectual to those who are perishing. But it's the same gospel. It's the same gospel. But Paul separates how the gospel impacts two different classes of people. Two different classes of people. But to the unbelieving person, the gospel